welcome everyone. We have with us Professor Stephen Zunes. Stephen is a professor of politics at the University of San Francisco and the director for Middle Eastern Studies. Welcome, Stephen. So glad to have you with us.
Great to be with you.
So, Stephen, tell us what what the center is, and kind of what your research and policy analysis looks at, and then we'll get into some specifics.
Well, Middle Eastern Studies is one of a number of interdisciplinary programs here at the University of San Francisco. It's not its own department, but it is a concentration people can have for their minor. Similarly, people in the International Studies program, they both should have a topical focus and a regional focus, and Middle Eastern Studies is one of them, along with other world regions. But we also have some, programming of, bringing in, speakers from varying perspectives and a number of other activities here on campus. Obviously, there's been increasing interest in the Middle East, particularly in the past couple of years with Israel's war in Gaza. And we're also one of the most diverse, one of the most diverse student bodies in the country. So there is, a great interest in international affairs overall.
Great. And you've been researching these topics for a lot more than 2 years. So what can you tell folks, like, what's your area of interest? Yeah, maybe what's your area of interest? What are some questions you've looked at?
Well, my particular interest is in U.S. foreign policy in the region. I was someone who came of age during the Vietnam War, and obviously, looking at the impact the United States has had on global affairs, both positive and negative, has long been a major interest of mine. And I'm broadly trained in international relations. It's not like I've visited the Middle East many times, but I've never actually lived there. My language skills are fairly limited. But my focus is more on the international relations, particularly the role of the United States. In the Middle East, even more than most regions, we see a real contradiction between the stated U.S. policy goals traditionally of supporting democracy, human rights, and international law, and our actual policies, where we've been willing to support some pretty brutal dictatorships, supporting the Israeli and Moroccan occupations, often being the lone dissenting vote in the UN Security Council when they've attempted to raise concerns or enforce international law. And it's this contradiction that has been a particular interest of mine. I was one of the, like many specialists in the region, that warned against the invasion of Iraq, saying it was illegal, unnecessary, and could lead us into a long, bloody counterinsurgency war that would lead to increased instability and terrorism. And similarly, ones that, while not denying the nefarious nature of Hamas, has raised concerns about the enormous civilian death toll and other war crimes committed by the U.S.-backed Israeli government.
So that was really clear. And the question I have is, like, so we have stated policy goals, and we have actual behaviors and actual outcomes. If you come from the premise that having is evidence of wanting, what could be the US's motivation in what we actually do that is so different from what we say our motivation is?
One hand, this isn't new. I mean, the United States has supported other genocidal wars. Guatemala against its indigenous population in the early 1980s, Indonesia and East Timor, Pakistan and Bangladesh in the early 70s. There's long been this contradiction, and it really goes back to, if you go back to the founding of the country. Our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence, were one of the most progressive documents in the world at that time. While at the same time we were committing genocide and ethnic cleansing against our indigenous population and enslaving Africans. If you go back even further to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Winthrop seeing this New Jerusalem, city on the hill, and the whole idea of manifest destiny, that we have these very high ideals. And yet our policies are very different. That's been compounded even more by becoming a global superpower. That
Mm,
you have certain imperatives of world power and upholding what are seen as economic and strategic interests, while at the same time, still being rooted in these idealistic goals. And I think what we see a lot, of course, is that we justify, policies, in the name of freedom, democracy, rule of law, because that's what Americans want to hear. I mean, even if you take a more
mm,
cynical realpolitik view of nation states, that governments, by their very nature, power relationships are inherently amoral. Citizens are moral. That's why we
mm.
saw such protests regarding Vietnam, Central America, South Africa, Iraq, and now regarding Israel and Palestine. And so, the governments, including ours, will use the kind of language to insist that what we're doing is right. And of course you also have the contradictions. I mean, President Biden, in reference to Ukraine, quite correctly saying no country can expand its territory by force. You cannot, change, unilaterally change international boundaries. That's clear in the UN Charter. While at that same time being the only administration that had formally recognized Israel's illegal annexation of the Golan and other occupied territories, and Morocco's illegal annexation of the entire nation of Western Sahara. So, I think what we do see is this, a sense that narrowly defined strategic interests do trump the values that we profess to support. But the good news is that because we, at least in theory, believe in those values, that Americans who are concerned about these policies, both on a moral level, but also recognizing in the long term it actually hurts U.S. interests, as we saw in Iraq and other cases. I mean, people on a very just a pragmatic, enlightened self-interest position oppose many of these policies as well. That we can and we have historically been able to create change. The big challenge now is we have a president who doesn't even pretend to support these
For
values.
these
His,
values,
his
it's true.
foreign policy is completely transactional. But I think and we are seeing pushback to that as well. Though, of course, many Americans are distracted by simply trying to save democracy here at home, much less
Yeah,
trying to protect democracy elsewhere.
anywhere else. Yeah, and I had a thought a while ago, but right directly to what you just said, you know, Donald Trump doesn't have the same incentives as other elected officials. He's never going to run for office again. It,
And he's also just, profoundly ignorant of foreign policy and history and geography, and indeed is rather impulsive in his actions. I mean, regarding the recent summit and meetings around Ukraine. Now, before important meetings like that, normally a president would have, uh, read through all sorts of briefing, papers, and in detail, have clear prep in terms of what are the red lines, in the meeting, and really, have it all
yeah,
thought out
that's not his
beforehand. But
style.
he didn't do
That's
any
not
of
his
that
style.
stuff. It was purely off the cuff, purely instinctual, and whether or not you agree with his policies. I mean, if you're going into a high stakes meeting like that, you really ought to be prepared and know what you're talking about.
So yeah, but I guess what I was just saying is we can push back all we want, but we don't have the usual levers available because either he'll eliminate elections or he'll
Mhm.
find it, or he'll or something else, but he's not running again.
Right, right. Though, he is concerned about his legacy, and there are certainly people around him who, or at least some of them, that might have a longer view. And we have seen how popular movements and protests have changed policies, like in Vietnam, like in Central America, like Southern Africa, like the arms race, like Iraq, even on East Timor. So the other part of my research, the two main areas I mentioned in the Middle East and U.S. policy, but I've also done quite a bit of work on civil resistance, the idea, the
Right.
power of strategic nonviolent action, and how that's, brought down, scores of dictatorial regimes, from Eastern Europe to Latin America and Africa and parts of Asia, and that it's actually more effective than armed struggle in most
Mm-hmm.
cases. And it's interesting. In fact, many of these articles of mine about these struggles in Eastern Europe or Latin America or Africa or elsewhere were in these obscure academic journals. But suddenly, I'm noticing there've been a lot of hits recently because people are starting to think, what can we learn from these anti-authoritarian struggles elsewhere that we could apply here
Here
against
and
the threat
now.
of authoritarianism at home?
Yeah, that's what I'm curious, because we're straddling democracy and authoritarianism in the moment, right? So in this position, like, what what advice could you give people about what are the levers of change to be pushing on, like based on seeing nonviolent struggles in overt dictatorships, and then also your awareness of policy levers in relative democracies, like, you know while we're in this in between zone, do you have thought any thoughts or observations on what seems to be effective?
The fundamental thing, and this is true about whether it's an outright dictatorship or a democratic system that's sliding towards authoritarianism, is that ultimately governments are only as powerful as people's willingness to obey them.
Mm,
That they can give orders, but if the people, in the civil service and the government bureaucracy refuse to do what they're told to do, if soldiers
mm-hmm,
refuse to do what they do, if ordinary citizens refuse, whether it be everything from with withholding taxes to disobeying curfews to just any number of other things, the government really doesn't have the power, and that's critical. Another critical aspect of resistance is to maintain nonviolent discipline. Even rock throwing or vandalism and that kind of thing, that it is can be used by the state, as an excuse for greater repression. And we see how, Trump has been willing to use the National Guard and all sorts of things in order to crack down and assert federal authority over states and municipalities. And it's real important that we maintain that nonviolent discipline. And sometimes that takes training. One
mm,
thing that I've been doing, I've worked with a number of NGOs on this over the years, primarily in the United States, but also some internationally, is to get people to think strategically and to about how you build a movement. Because just like an electoral campaign or a military campaign, um, you need to think strategically. You need to
mm,
think how to sequence your tactics. You need to practice, do training. I mean, some of you know the history of the civil rights movement, the classic case of, when they did these role plays, of the cops, using rolled up newspapers, as the batons,
mm,
or people, harassing them and using the N-word and that kind of thing, and people needing to get in practice to keep their cool, and don't respond. And
mm-hmm,
if they feel they can't keep their cool, they'll maybe help out the movement in another way, but not do the
right.
civil disobedience part. Um, but you need training, you need practice, you think strategically. Being right is not enough, and so
Mm,
I think that is really how, like I say, just like in any other kind of campaign, that those involved in nonviolent movements against authoritarianism and in support of other causes need to be able to think strategically.
mm. Yeah, being right, it's not enough is one of my big slogans as well. um and also, you're talking about the inner work, like, because our instinct when attacked is to defend, and the ways that we instinctively defend can be used as excuses by repressors. So yeah, so really, practicing in advance, having that
Mhm.
that grounded approach.
Exactly.
Um, and 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 I think you said this, and I really want to underline it. It's not that throwing rocks at people in tanks is um like this horrifying act of violence, right?
This is not a
Or
moral judgment. It's not a
it's not a
moral
moral
judgment.
judgment,
We're,
right?
we're thinking strategically. I mean, if you look at these scores of movements that have brought down dictatorships, that have restored democracy, the vast majority of the participants and even the leaders were not pacifist. These are people who did it because they recognized it was the best way of doing it. Gandhi and King are the notable exceptions. I mean, they were both moral and spiritual leaders committed to nonviolence as a principle, as well as brilliant
Strategists and
strategists. But again,
rhetoricians.
they're the exception. Again, the vast majority are doing so because they recognize that it is the most effective means. So I don't pass moral judgment for people who will engage in street fighting or even take up arms. I'm just talking about in certain situations. What I'm talking about is, what works. I mean, 'cause that's really the key issue here.
Yeah, yeah, thanks for that. And then so looking specifically at, Israel, US, Palestine,
Mhm.
what what is motivating, like, well, actually, I think there's two questions and we'll do them one at a time. What I think most people know what the US policy is. I think we've given, I want to say $50 billion worth of arms.
More than that, but yeah.
Oh, in the last 2 years,
Yeah.
supplemental beyond 4 billion a year that we'd already committed to.
Mhm.
Um, all kinds of political cover, um, standing ovations for Benjamin Netanyahu,
Mhm.
like 40 standing ovations in an
Yeah.
hour or something
Yeah.
unthinkable for a
For an
genocidal,
indicted war criminal, right?
for an indicted criminal, which he already was. Yeah. Um, so we know what the policy is, and I think the two questions are kind of like why the policy and the impact of the policy.
I think the primary, I mean, there are a number of reasons. I mean, on ideological level, on the right, you have many Christian fundamentalists who see modern Israel as a fulfillment of biblical prophecy, and they see Israel versus Palestine as Israelites versus Philistines, and whose side God is on, and there's this belief among many of them, millennialist types, and there are close to 40 million of them at least, who literally believe that a strong, dominant Israel is necessary for the second coming of Christ. Now, part of the scenario, of course, is that the Jews would be, who failed to convert, would be condemned to eternal damnation. But they want the Jews for part one, not part two. And since the Israelis don't expect that to happen anyway, they're glad to welcome their support.
The support. Yeah.
The other end, you have an older generation of liberals who have this kind of romantic view of Israel, kind of like Paul Newman in Exodus from back in the 60s, and the plucky kibbutzniks, the brave volunteers, the survivors of the Holocaust after 2,000 years, finally having a country of their own. And there's a real idealization. In many ways, it reminds me of the old communist who's still identified with Stalin and the Soviet Union, or even some leftists today rationalize for Maduro or Ortega, because they want to believe in socialism so bad that and because a lot of the criticisms from the U.S. really are imperialistic and hypocritical and things like that, they assume that it's all must all be false, and then try to defend them.
Mhm.
And similarly, a lot of people around do that around Israel. They want to believe in the ideal of the labor Zionist, dream, that they don't recognize, just how far to the right Israel's become. They assume because there is some anti-Semitism and double standards in criticizing Israel, they assume all the criticism is. And so I think there's that, and I think, and when you look at the leadership of the Democratic Party, I mean, they're very much part of that generation, and there's probably no issue where the leadership is actually more out of sync with their constituent. I mean, 78% of registered Democrats, wants to suspend military aid to Israel, want the U.S. to formally recognize Palestine. the Democratic National Committee just voted down voted down resolutions that were calling, for just that. Um, so that's the ideological side. I mean, I think the main thing, frankly, is the States sees Israel as an important strategic asset in a very important region. I mean, our Arab allies could be overthrown in a coup or revolution, but Israel is there to stay. Israel, in the words of one former Secretary of State, is our unsinkable aircraft carrier.
Phew.
Biden, both as a senator and later as president, said if it weren't for Israel, we'd have to invent them
Mhm.
because we need that kind of surrogate in the region. So, it's the same reason we've supported dubious right-wing governments, for decades, seen as our strategic interests. Now, I haven't mentioned AIPAC and the Israel lobby up to this point. Because I think a lot of people exaggerate. I think that's the only reason that we support Israel. And AIPAC and these right-wing Zionist groups have made it more difficult to challenge U.S. policy and reverse U.S. policy. They have created a climate of intimidation on Capitol Hill. But I would argue that, again, while it made it more difficult to change the policy, the overall thrust of U.S. policy would be more or less the same for the reasons I've mentioned, that we do tend to overlook international law and human rights and even public opinion if we're in our support of countries that are seen as strategic assets. The good reason, a good positive thing is that that not only is public opinion overall shifting, is towards being willing to be more critical of Israel and support Palestinian rights more. But we're seeing huge shifts in the Jewish community as well, especially among younger Jews.
Mhm.
Um, I think some are questioning, Zionism as a whole, but others are saying, even those who consider themselves Zionists are saying, no, this is a far right government. They really are committing war crimes. We really do need to change things here. And so I think, that isn't easier for some people who,
Yeah, I'm thinking about my legislator I've been talking to. One of them I think is committed Zionist, and one of them I think he's afraid of getting targeted by AIPAC. He's in a seat. It flips and flops. Um, and he says a lot of things that that yeah, he says a lot of things that don't match a lot of other things he says. Kind of like he's got something in their background
Mhm.
that they're not saying. Yeah.
Mhm.
Um, what is the impact of the U.S. being so like lockstep with Israeli policy, no matter what it is?
I mean, I mean the impact on the ground. Of course, we see it, and the tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians who have died, and the systematic destruction of Gaza. I mean, they're not just bombing buildings; these are deliberate detonations. They are quite serious about going through Trump and Netanyahu's plan of leveling the place and expelling the Palestinians and creating this Mediterranean resort. That kind of.
Yeah, I don't believe that last step.
But they're
But
getting
but
they're,
but
they're,
but
they're
they are serious about leveling it
yeah, yeah,
and
yeah,
and
and
cleaning everybody or kicking everyone out. Yeah.
right, and the United States has made it possible by vetoing these UN Security Council resolutions. I mean, most governments engaging this kind of thing would be under serious sanctions right now. And if you look historically, when Israel has moderated its policies, it's been as a direct result of U.S. pressure. I mean, Biden could have stopped this very early. Trump could do it now, because we've seen previous presidents, Eisenhower, Carter, the senior president Bush, Obama, have all been able to successfully pressure Israel to stop military offenses or withdraw from recently conquered territory simply by threatening to withhold aid. and AIPAC couldn't stop them. That they were
Mm.
able to do so regardless. So this is not a
Well,
tail wag.
APAC actually didn't exist.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. They're not in the Eisenhower.
Oh, that's what you mean.
Yeah,
Well, even
so what I'm saying
yeah,
is
yeah, yeah.
that so what I'm
Oh,
saying is
got
that
it, got
they had the U.S. has always had that power, and they have it today. This is not a tail wagging the dog situation, as some people, claim. That Israel really is dependent
it.
on the U.S. on so many levels, and we really could, put an end into the slaughter. Now, I mentioned we've supported other genocides before, but most of those a lot of people didn't even know about until well after the fact because they're in these remote rural areas of the Guatemalan highlands or an isolated island in the East Indies, that kind of thing. But we are seeing this on our TV screens, on our computer screens, on our phones. I mean, there's no denying what's going on. So in many ways, this makes it particularly horrific that the United States is making this possible. And and despite the rationalizations to defend our politicians, Biden's working day and night to get a ceasefire. No, we got a ceasefire long a time ago if the U.S. had applied the pressure. And I guess one other thing I have to mention that AIPAC strategic interests notwithstanding, if Israel was doing this to white Christian Europeans, we would not allow for this. I think we have to acknowledge the racism and Islamophobia, which is part of the equation as well. And I think one reason that the younger people are willing to have a much more critical view than their elders is that we are an increasingly diverse population, and that a generation that has been shaped by Black Lives Matter, by greater recognition of indigenous rights and that kind of thing. See Israel and Palestine from very different lens.
And
Those of us an older generation who again had this more romantic view of
yeah.
Zionism as a national liberation movement of an oppressed people. Younger people see it more as a colonial settler state, and there are elements of both certainly in Zionism. But I think that this more critical perspective has really been shaping the attitude. I mean, I see it in my students. I mean, when I first started teaching Middle Eastern politics, I bent over backwards to explain the Palestinian narrative because I assumed correctly that most people were familiar with and supported the Israeli narrative, and didn't really know the Palestinian narrative. Now, if anything, it's the other way around. I have to
Mm.
really try to let people understand whether they agree with it or not. I don't pass judgment on this, but at
Advocate
least
for
they
it, yeah.
understand the Zionist narrative and what the original, idealistic ideals, behind the movement. Though, of course, Zionism has contradictions, from the get-go. Again, as I said, just as American society in our founding, and indeed, that's one reason I think the United States identifies with Israel so much. That we do have this contradiction of many of these progressive ideals in our founding, but again, done on the backs of the indigenous population.
Mm. It really warms my heart to think that part of it, like my thought was, well, they have Instagram and people over 60 don't, or a lot of people over 60 aren't getting the direct information. They're watching network news, whatever. But it warms my heart to think that the Black Lives Matter movement got people thinking about who society kills with impunity.
Yes. Mhm.
Yeah, because a lot of the policy shifts hoped for in the Black Lives Matter movement either didn't go through or got reversed. But it's good
Mhm.
to think that there's been a cultural shift.
Very much so.
So we're getting toward the end of our time. So your free gift for folks is your Substack. Anything you want to say about
Yes,
that?
well, welcome people to sign on. I have articles that come out, twice a month, fairly short pieces, 1,200, 1,500 words that I talk about, mostly U.S. Middle East policy, though I occasionally weigh in on other foreign and domestic policy issues. Also, I'm fairly active on Facebook, and at least my more politically oriented posts are included there. Um, And and I can also be followed on Blue Sky, on X. I have a website, www.stephenzunes.org, stphzunes.org. And but Substack is probably the most efficient way, and you can sign on for free.
So great. Thank you for your time. Thank you for this conversation. And thank you for the work that you're doing, letting people understand the world.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm going to stop recording.